There's been a significant development in South Australia. It's even being touted as something like a nation first from South Australia. Exit strategies for women in prostitution. Last week, the Hon Nicola Centofanti MLC introduced a bill in the South Australian Legislative Council designed to offer comprehensive exit strategies for individuals engaged in prostitution. The intent is to grant those who seek to exit the sex trade immunity from existing criminal provisions. Well, Wendy Francis is the Australian Christian Lobby National Director for Politics, and she's across this detail. Hello, Wendy. Welcome back to 2020.
Thank you, Neil, very much for having me. It's so good to be talking about something so important.
Wendy, this bill, a first of its kind, proposed in Australia. How do you see it?
Yes, it's wonderful. It's wonderful news, actually. And I'm not surprised that it's South Australia that has brought this bill in, because South Australia has got a long history in Australia and globally of standing up for women's rights. So it was the first colony, it was still a colony at the time, it was the first colony to give women the right to vote. It's the first place in the world to not only give women the right to vote, but also to stand for Parliament. The first public school in South Australia was actually a girls' school. So there's a long history of standing up for women's rights. And so it's been in prostitution, in the prostitution legislation area in South Australia. It's been an ongoing conversation as to how we can best support women, and it is mainly women. There are some men in prostitution, but by far and away, it's women. How do we best support these women? And one of the ways that globally is being looked at is the Nordic model of prostitution. Now, this is not the Nordic model of prostitution that South Australia is proposing, but it is an aspect of that legislation.
And we might touch on that Nordic model just before we end our conversation, but come back to Nicola Centofanti, and what she's proposing is a strategic exit strategy for people who want to get out of this industry. How important is that provision in this bill?
Huge, because women in prostitution, the evidence will all point to well over 80%. It's something like 86% of women who are asked if they would like to exit the industry, that they say yes, they want to exit the industry. That's a global figure. But what stops them is often poverty, but it's also a sense of shame. There is trafficking involved in prostitution. There is certainly a sense of underworld sort of crime. There is an element of that. And so this bill will actually provide exit strategies for women who want to leave the prostitution industry. I'm just looking at my research now. It's actually 89% of prostituted persons want to exit the industry. That's my figure. And so, we're often talking about financial destitution. We're talking about even coercive control, which is part of domestic violence that we encourage people to leave. So this bill will actually provide exit strategies. It will provide the ability to find accommodation, for instance, employment, possibly education, training services, even accessing health and legal services. That's the sort of exit strategies that will be put in place if this bill actually gets voted up. And it's looking really promising that it will.
Wendy, let's just pause for a moment to reflect on what public perception of prostitution might be. And in some sense, there'll be some who think, well, women who are in prostitution, well, they're empowered to do so. They're using their bodies for something that they might see as empowering for women, and they might even enjoy being in that industry. What do you think the public perception is like compared to, you just quoted some pretty damning statistics on what people would think about getting out of it. 89%, I think you said, wanted to get out. That's not what a lot of people perceive in their mind, is it?
No, people in prostitution are vulnerable people, and it more than ever, it's women. It's not men who are in prostitution. It's women. In Adelaide itself, if you visit the brothels, you find that many of the women in the brothels can't even speak English. So many of them enter a brothel, their passports are taken from them. Sometimes they are illegal immigrants, and when they're found out, they're actually deported or put into detention centres. It is not something that middle class or upper class women are involved in. It is vulnerable women who are involved in prostitution. And once they're in, it's very hard to escape, because these women often, to even fulfill what is required of them, they have to drink heavily, or they often take drugs. And so then that habit is really hard to cover financially. And so they get trapped, and they're in this trap that just spirals down and down and down. Their children are often taken from them in terrible situations, and these women are victims themselves. And so, I mean, we see it right through the Bible, don't we, Neil, where Jesus actually reached out to women in similar circumstances and lifted them out of that circumstance. Yes, he said, go and sin no more, but he lifted them out. He didn't despise them, and neither can we.
And now, this bill is not being voted into law yet, but if it is, then that would require the government to provide some level of practical support to vulnerable people who are seeking to exit the sex trade. That's one of those big hurdles that has to be there. And as you say, as a Christian, you'll reflect on Jesus helping people get free from that, and then government here has that opportunity.
Absolutely. The bill was only introduced on the 5th of June, so it's just been introduced, but we are hearing that it has a very good chance of getting through. Do you know that prostitution, complete decriminalisation of prostitution, which would actually give licence to pimps and traffickers to act without regulation, it has been put forward in the South Australian Parliament 14 times so far and failed. So there has been a long push for prostitution to actually increase in South Australia. This is the first bill that's actually got up that will decrease prostitution in South Australia. And so we know that financially, even though there is a cost to providing exit strategies, the actual cost that is involved in these women who, most of them suffer from some sort of PTSD. Their children are often in care. All of the rehab that is required, and even just the crime that is accompanied by this, all of this costs the state an enormous amount of money. So there is this will not be even cost neutral. The state, even though they will be paying money, will end up reaping the reward from this legislation.
As you say, there's a likelihood that this legislation could become law. And so when it comes to, retraining and finding accommodation, those sorts of things all around health and legal services, getting another job, these sorts of things, this is what this bill is proposing that is going to make it possible for particularly women here to leave their trade.
And in other countries, what we've found is the people who step forward to actually give those services and help these women are people like the Salvation Army. So often they're these Christian organisations that step forward and say, we will be there for you. In the same way that people sometimes who exit jail, there are organisations that step forward and say, we will be there for you, we will help you so that you don't go back into that same situation. And so often what we've found globally, it is organisations like the Salvation Army that put their hand up. They receive funding from the government to be able to provide these exit strategies, but they do so in a wholesome way, pointing people back to the love of God.
Wendy, while we're almost celebrating, maybe a bit too premature to celebrate because, this is not law yet, it's just a bill, but it's going to be debated in South Australia. And we know that prostitution laws differ around the nation. What does this mean? If this gets across the line in South Australia, what might that mean for other states and territories who are also looking at prostitution laws?
Absolutely. It will empower other states and territories to do the same thing. Particularly, it's interesting that Nicola Centofanti is the one who has brought this bill forward. It's a female in the South Australian Parliament. So it will help other females to stand up and say, you know what, we want to stand up for our sisterhood as well. And there, but by the grace of God, go I. And so we will do what we can to help the most vulnerable within our sisterhood. And so I think that if it passes in South Australia, we will most likely see a domino effect, because the results will be positive. The results will see women becoming active citizens, being able to stand up proudly, take a job, be with their children at their school plays, and not be sneaking off somewhere at night to have to fulfill an awful role that they are currently have to perform. So it's a positive. We see it as something of a first, and we're really praying that it will get through.
Now, the sort of model this comes under, you mentioned this a little earlier, the Nordic model, or what's really now become known as the equality model. And it works so many different nations, some of those in Northern Europe. Do you think it's really got the capacity to work well here in Australia?
Look, it has, but I think every country tweaks legislation to go with their culture. But the Nordic model basically decriminalises prostitution. So what it does is it says that the victims in this are the women who are in prostitution. So it removes the fact that they will actually be penalised, to allow them to actually go to the police. So it allows them the freedom to actually report what's happening to them. So it removes that, but it also it makes the buying of sex actually illegal. So it penalises the buying of sex. It says it's not okay. It's not okay to purchase somebody else's body, to do to them whatever you want to do. It's not okay. And so those are the two main aspects of the Nordic bill. But the third big aspect of the Nordic bill is the exit strategies. And so that's what we're focusing on here in Australia, these exit strategies to actually help women who want to get out to be able to do that without getting in trouble for wanting to say, hang on a minute, I'm in prostitution. Because still in South Australia, prostitution is actually illegal, but it's thriving in an underbelly sort of trade. So we want women to be able to put up their hand and say, I want out and I need help.
And our Christian motivation being involved in this whole issue is that even as you use those statistics, Wendy Francis, 89% of women who are in prostitution long to get out. So standing alongside those vulnerable women for the Christian position of saying, let's see you get liberated from what is really a trafficking and a degrading practice for women. Let me point listeners to the Australian Christian Lobby website, where you might be able to find more resources and understand what's happening in South Australia. acl.org.au. acl.org.au. Wendy Francis is the Australian Christian Lobby National Director of Politics. Wendy, thanks so much for another update today on 2020.
Thank you again, Neil. I'm grateful.